But their view of humility tends to be what I mentioned earlier about being able to manipulate Christians. Being humble means you don't take a position, you don't want to offend the other person. It's going beyond classical liberalism I was mentioning before, because in classical liberalism, you can say, here's my view. I think it's true, and I think I can argue against your view. But this view is more about the feelings and not offending other people. And so it actually ties in well, that view of humility ties in well with the radical DEI stuff. In contrast to that, I was thinking about how it's because courage is not really well understood. And courage tends to mean people that hold this view of humility, they'll think of courage as being abrupt, uncaring, stampeding over your opponent, maybe toxic masculinity. And so actual courage doesn't get talked about.
My guest this week is Dr. Owen Anderson, and he's a 20-year professor of philosophy here in Phoenix at Arizona State University, plus the pastor of Historic Christian Church, and also a certified jiu-jitsu instructor. He's also an example of a man who's been within the university system and has watched his institution, like many others, degenerate from being a campus of higher learning to a fortress of forced ideology. And when writing this, I almost typed forced idolatry, but I think that works too. So what does a man do in a scenario like that? He fights back, of course, but not with fists, rather with confident and courageous words, because Dr. Anderson runs a popular and growing blog on Substack, which is linked in the show notes. There he documents the ongoing and expanding madness that's consuming the school's administration, the various departments, the students, and his colleagues. The blog even brought him to the attention of CrossPolitic, who hosted him last week. And it makes sense that Moscow would want to highlight him because principled and calibrated resistance to institutionalized degeneracy, also known as the regime, should be the cornerstone of how Christian men and women approach this unique moment in American history. We each must do what we can, when we can, and how we can, and do it all confidently and to the glory of God. And I hope this conversation with Dr. Anderson sets an example for you to follow. In our conversation, Dr. Anderson and I discussed his background with ASU, the third meaning of DEI, the evaporation of classical liberalism, how Dennis Prager became a white nationalist, being manipulated with Christian virtues, the most successful cult leader in history, and finally, how to hit universities where it hurts. If you enjoy the Renaissance of Men podcast, thank you. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Plus, leave a comment down below letting us know where DEI shows up in your life. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. I release new interviews related to Christian virtue, the family, and the culture wars every Friday. Quick note before we begin. If you're inspired by Dr. Anderson's story, the most important thing that you can do to help his cause is subscribe to his Substack. Recent news events have shown that woke corporations will bow to the will of the people. If good men and women are courageous enough to put forth a coordinated effort, you can assist Dr. Anderson in his field of battle by simply subscribing to his Substack and telling a friend. That link is in the show notes. And please welcome this week's guest on the podcast, a professor of philosophy at Arizona State University, pushing back in the front lines against wokeness, Dr. Owen Anderson. Dr. Anderson, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to join you.
So we were connected by Pastor David Reese, who I had on the show a few weeks ago, and he's a good friend as well. And he connected me with you and told me a little bit about your story at Arizona State and some of the things you're dealing with, DEI, inclusion, and all that. And so I've been excited to have this conversation with you and get some window into that.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's going to be I think it'll be a really enlightening discussion for everybody.
I agree. So maybe we can start with giving the audience a bit of a sense of your background and what you've been doing at ASU and the fields of study as well.
Yeah, I've been a professor at ASU for over 20 years, where I teach philosophy and religious studies and some history, intellectual history. So I've really, and then I also happened to go to ASU. So I did my undergraduate there, I did a master's degree there, and then I did PhD there. So I've really been at ASU for a while. I've got a really in-depth insider knowledge of the institution.
Wow. Okay. So 3 degrees from Arizona State.
Yep.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so your history goes back, quite a ways, and getting to see the evolution of the university over the course of a number of decades.
Yeah. Back to the mid 90s. And actually, my dad went to ASU. So
Oh my goodness.
I was playing in the sand of what is now Tempe Town Lake. Back before it was filled up, little 4-year-old Owen would go down there and play in the sand.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, as we were talking just before we hit record, I also grew up here in Phoenix, and so I have my family has a connection to Arizona State. My grandfather, his chrome plating company plated all the seats in Sun Devil Stadium. I would go to ASU football games as a kid.
Yep.
So we have this in common.
Well, and for anyone who doesn't live in Phoenix, they may not know how ASU is in a town that's adjacent to Phoenix, Tempe, but it really dominates Phoenix. And especially over the last few decades, has grown to have campuses across Phoenix. So it's one of the biggest employers in the state, one of the most influential institutions in the state.
Oh, I didn't actually. It makes sense, but I didn't actually know that. So that adds some more context to some of the things that have been going on. So let's start then with you. I've been reading your Substack, and I think everyone by this point will be familiar with the ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and environmental social governance, all these wonderful terms. But you've been facing these in a particular way within the university context. So maybe let's start there. Maybe we'll just start with your beginnings at Arizona State and when you started to see these things to develop, and then we'll get into how they come into what's going on today.
Yeah. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let me tell everyone, I have a Substack. So you go to Substack.com, look up Dr. Owen Anderson. I started this over a year ago just to document what's going on at ASU. So you get a little bit of my commentary, but also it's really important just to show people. And that's what I meant when I said this will be an enlightening discussion. Because when I tell parents of prospective students what's actually going on at ASU, they're surprised. Like, it can't be that bad. Is that right? And so I'm just sharing the kinds of talks, the kinds of presentations, the kinds of social media posts that professors are sharing to tell people, it's everyone kind of knows universities are liberal. It's way past those days. Those days are in the rearview mirror. It's into radical leftism. So that's the reason for my Substack. It's Dr. Owen Anderson, and if your viewers go on and look at it, that'll be really helpful. So DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, could mean different things. So it kind of got into the system because one of the things it means is that you learn about unique challenges different students face. So students from different backgrounds, economic backgrounds, religious and cultural backgrounds, have different challenges. And a good teacher needs to know what those challenges are. And so that makes a lot of sense. And it can be introduced that way. And every teacher will agree, okay, good, help me understand what I need to know. The second way it can be introduced, and this is the way that the TV show The Office made fun of, is it can come in as learning how to relate with and work with people from different backgrounds. And so again, if you're working in a large corporation, you say, yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to be working with lots of different people, and it's good for us all to learn problem-solving skills, how to interact with each other, what to do if there's a conflict resolution. So those two senses of DEI is the kind you'll see presented to the public. And someone will say, the ASU spokesman said, what's the big deal about these? We're just trying to include people. But DEI means a third thing now, and that's what I'm documenting on my Substack so people can see the evidence. And what it means now is race blame. So I was asked 2 years ago to take a required DEI training course. And Arizona has a law that prohibits taxpayer money from being used for classes that teach race blame or any other kind of racism. And so when I saw the content of that course, I said, I'm not going to take this. It focuses on the problem of whiteness. It says that the United States was founded as a white nationalist or a white supremacist country and has been white supremacist ever since. And then if you're currently white, you have unconscious biases and you have privilege that you didn't earn, and you need to name your unconscious biases and recognize your privilege. So all of that is race blame. All of that is the essence of racism. It's looking at someone's skin color and then judging them based on that skin color. And on top of that, judging them for things that people in the past did, with maybe they had a similar skin color, but there may not be any direct relationship between them, and then attributing that blame to the present. So I said, no, that's wrong. I'm not going to take that. But it continued to be listed as required, and eventually, after the time period passed, it says I'm overdue in red letters. And so I started writing on my Substack about this. The Goldwater Institute, which is it's a national think tank a legal think tank, but it's especially located here, named after our Senator Barry Goldwater, and they specialize in checking government overreach. And so they got interested and they said, hey, there's a case here because ASU is breaking the law by in three ways. First, requiring this class. Second, the class content. And then third, there's a quiz attached to the class. And the quiz is compelled speech, meaning it'll say something like, true or false, heteronormativity is the big problem facing our country. And you got to put true down, even if you don't agree about that being a problem. So they said that's compelled
There's a right
speech.
answer.
Yeah, so that's the three parts of it. And what Goldwater did was they filed this complaint in March, and they attached 183 pages of the content of this DEI training to the complaint, so people can look for themselves. Because the first thing ASU did, their media person or spokesman came out and said, it's not required, and it doesn't do any race blame. It doesn't violate the law at all. And so what Goldwater did is say, well, here's the content. People can decide for themselves. Here's where the transcript says whiteness is our problem. White people have privilege. All of that's race blame. So then the development since then, this lawsuit started in March, and so we're still in the middle of it. And ASU has agreed to one of those three things. They agreed no longer to have a quiz. So the complaint's being modified now to take that part out. So that's one of three. Good, 33% victory so far. But we got to address the other two. It does say required. They're saying it's not required. I've shared screenshots to show it says required, so they can easily change their webpage and portal if that's true. And then the second one, really the big one, is the content. Interestingly, what they've said so far is that they included a module at the beginning of the training. And in that first module, it's called Module 0, they introduce it and they say, we don't intend any race blame in what follows. Well, that doesn't mean you can break the law later. Just by saying, hey, I don't intend to break the law in my later actions. I mean, everybody could say that and exempt themselves from breaking the law. That what matters is not Module 0. What matters is the actual content of the classes, which is what the Goldwater Institute made public and which I've been making public on my Substack. So that's kind of the big story about what DEI is nationally right now. And your audience probably has seen things like the 3 university presidents last November testifying before Congress and being asked questions about Israel and DEI. And after that, 2 of those presidents had to step down. One of them was the president of Harvard. So that's a big deal. So we've been seeing this kind of nationally, that people are becoming aware that DEI doesn't just mean those first 2 things. It doesn't just mean helping students with unique challenges. It doesn't just mean working together with people who have different backgrounds. It now means teaching race blame.
So yes, so I read on your Substack about Module 0 and how it said something about we don't intend to cause harm, something like that. Yeah. Like it was like, we don't intend to cause harm with any of this, but then it goes and then it causes harm. It's like, well, we didn't intend for that to happen, so it's not our fault.
Yeah,
it's very bizarre and transparent.
Well, yeah, imagine you tell the judge, hey, I didn't intend to speed. I know I was speeding. Before I got on my car, I made a voice recorder, and I said in my voice recorder, I don't intend to speed. Well, that doesn't exempt you. You were speeding. That's right.
Well, this is very interesting because you're a professor of philosophy as well, and for 20 years. So this must have interesting, I mean, not to get too abstract, but philosophical dimensions where it's like the idea that that someone can post, our intention is not to do this, and then do it, and then that absolves them. Like, what is that communicating from a philosophical kind of perspective?
Well, and of any major, I felt I had a special obligation to say something because as philosophers, we often look to Socrates as our example, and Socrates had to oppose the whole city of Athens and tell them, although they thought they were wise, they weren't actually wise. And so I find myself in that same place where if a philosopher won't stand up and say, wait a minute, this is wrong, who will? I feel like I'd have to give up my philosopher card. Like they'd come and hey, you can't be a philosopher anymore. You didn't stand up. But it is surprising to me how many, it's just me. I mean, I've received some people calling me or texting me or emailing me at ASU saying thank you. But I'm the only one speaking out. I'm not saying that to blame anyone because people's careers are at stake. And that's the terrible part about this. Legally, it's called the chilling effect in First Amendment law. And so what they do is they'll tell you, you have freedom of speech. You can do whatever you want. But you know that your promotions, possibly your increase in salary, you're getting classes you like to take, you're being on committees you want to be on. All of that depends on your being on the good side of the administrators. So even though they tell you, yeah, you have freedom of speech, you have academic freedom, the chilling effect is that, well, I could end up in bad consequences, or, and this is a real thing, my peers won't talk to me anymore. I'll go to my meetings and they'll glare at me, which is what I have to suffer now. But I'm in a position, in terms of the ranking, I'm at what's called a full professor, so I'm at the highest rank. And so all the more I felt, hey, I need to speak up. It's kind of an obligation as a senior professor, someone who's been in the system. So when I say no one's speaking up, I'm not blaming anybody. All of us are put in a terrible situation we shouldn't be in.
So it's like you're in the best position in some sense to push back, but also the worst position in that you've ascended to the heights in your career and you've earned the position that you've gained over 2 decades of service to the university plus 3 degrees. So like your life history and that of your family is bound up with this institution, inextricably bound up with this institution. And so now real wrong, real deception, real evil in many ways has come in, and there are real consequences for speaking up. Maybe you can speak to some of the consequences that you've experienced holding the position that you do, and then also your Substack as well.
Yeah, well, they're first and foremost, there's ones that you can't measure. Those are the ones that happen the most often, and I can document them, but it's hard to measure them if it ever came to a court case. So I call those the social ones. So you'll be ostracized and treated poorly for having what is a minority position. Now, these are the same professors who will speak highly of treating people in marginalized viewpoints or minority viewpoints with special care. But when it comes to their own relationships, besides me and my faculty, it's just me. Everyone else is an echo chamber. They all believe the same things. They all talk about the same things. So I'm the only person that represents actual intellectual diversity, and I'm socially set out, ostracized. But the things you can measure, I've had to file some complaints about those within internal ASU HR. So there are some things I've said, hey, I've got this email, this was wrong, and I can measure that and file complaints. They're not very important to the university, so they kind of slow walk it. Maybe nothing comes of it. But at least for the future, I've got it documented that I did say something when this happened to me.
Right. Maybe we can run back the clock a little bit, and we can look into what were some of the first signs that you saw that this was coming down the pike. So I was in university in the mid '90s. So I was at Stanford in Northern California, and even then, my freshman year was '96. Even then, when I came in as a freshman, one of the things that happened that I participated in was that everyone who had come from all around the country to go to this university immediately started sorting themselves almost unconsciously into their various racial and ethnic groups.
Really?
So it's like, oh, and I found myself as a result in the Jewish Students Association because that was the nearest proximate one to me. But I look back on that now, and plus, the university had ethnic theme dorms, they called them. There was a Latin American, Black, Asian theme dorms that had to be 50% of the theme race. So I lived in the Black theme dorm for 2 years. Wow. Actually quite enjoyed it, but this was in the mid '90s. This was going on. So we're talking like 25 years ago. Yeah, exactly. More than 25, almost 30 years ago. So maybe you've seen some of those things going back a couple decades when you came in, or has it just come on kind of all at once recently?
When I was a undergrad in the 90s at ASU, we didn't have those sorts of things. I don't remember when different graduations started. We have graduations based on race or ethnicity or culture now, or sexual identity now. So you might go to the normal one, or the one for everyone, I should say, not normal, but that's the one that includes the people you'd call white. But then there's other ones that are differentiated based on those other identities. And so I've noticed that, and that's been something I've posted about, just because if you're going to do that, you've got to do it for everyone. So you might end up having the white graduation or the Christian graduation, and not just for some groups. No one's brought a lawsuit about that yet, but it would be interesting to see what would happen, because that can be a form of discrimination by singling out some groups and not permitting the same rights to other groups. So I've noticed that kind of thing, but I haven't noticed the dorms that you mentioned. I don't know if we have that yet. I have seen a push for transgender dorms. And I'm not entirely sure what that means, because all of the different identities are already protected under law. You can't discriminate against any of those identities in housing. And so I'm not
Mhm.
sure what it would mean to say, hey, we don't have the same rights as others and we need those rights. I'm pretty sure those identities do. And if you've had those rights denied, you should sue the university, because that's already federal law that you can't discriminate based on sexual identity. But that's something I've been seeing recently on campus getting pushed.
Do you do you hear from students who are experiencing discrimination in this way, from the white or the Christian students, that hey, this is happening and we don't really know what to do about it? Or do you find, that people are just kind of going heads down and trying to muddle through?
Well, yeah, I do hear from some, and they tend to be the focus does tend to be Christianity, and that's another reason I'm speaking up. Is
Yeah.
I would speak up just in terms of the discrimination of it generally, but then it also turns out that it's mostly focused on Christians, and especially in what I just mentioned about sexuality. It calls the view that God created man, male and female, and ordained marriage between a man and a woman a bigoted view and heteronormativity.
Hmm.
But that's, of course, essential to, you could say, all three theistic religions, but especially it's right there in Genesis. So the Christians and the Jews would say, no, that's the word of God. And so as I started to see faculty members calling Genesis the bigoted view, I realized, no, now I got to say something now, especially. So I think it comes after Christians a certain way. And unfortunately, Christians in our day, they have a view of loving your neighbor that is easily manipulated. And so
Hmm.
liberalism has been doing that for over a century. And it will say to, the liberal intellectual is generally not a Christian or not a practicing Christian, but they'll say to the Christians, if you loved your neighbor and your Bible says you should, then you would want to have the government take tax money to pay for the poor and stuff
Right.
like this. And so, unfortunately, even when there are Christian students coming in, they're easily manipulated by professors like that, who say somehow work into love your neighbor, a strong centralized government that overtaxes to pay for welfare benefits. That's what love your neighbor
Hmm.
means. So a lot of Christians say, yeah, I guess that's right. I guess I should become a liberal and pick a cause. And so students often feel they need to become a radical who has an agenda of some kind and can advocate. That's the word, not agenda, advocate.
Hmm.
So you become an advocate. And there's entire degrees that will teach you how to be an advocate. And then you pick from like a list of 10 liberal causes. And so right now we're seeing this erupt in Columbia University, right? So you might say, well, my liberal cause is Palestine. And so I'm going to go to Columbia University and live in the encampment and protest Israel. And so students are given this idea that even Christian students, that's what loving your neighbor requires.
Hmm. And there's no one really in the university context generally who's pushing back on this, because I imagine. Go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say no. And it's interesting how it is. Yeah, there's no one. There's a few of down in Tempe. There's two schools. There's a school and a center. There's the School of Historical and Economic Leadership. I'm getting that one wrong. It's related to that. And they've got some good classical scholars. And then there's the Center for American Institutions, which has got some good scholars. But both of those are
Hmm.
relatively small compared to the thousands of professors who are on the other side. So it's like 99.9% are radical far left. And then there's a tiny number of us who, what I call myself, is classical liberal in this setting. So in this setting, I
Hmm.
believe that a state university does serve an important need. It may not be the ideal, but it serves an important need for students, for parents and students who can't afford private universities, but they need a college education. And so the state university steps in to fill that void, and it's been run on classical liberal grounds. What that means is it's not partisan, and it doesn't have a dogma. So you can go
Hmm.
to a state university with you might be a Republican, a Democrat, a Green Party, Libertarian. The university doesn't take a position on that. Same thing with religion. You
Hmm.
could be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu. The university doesn't take a position on that. So what the university teaches you to do is how to correctly understand the people you disagree with. So you should understand what Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam teach, and you should be able to repeat it to someone in that religion in a way that they'd say, yeah, you understand me, you get it. Now you can say I
Hmm.
disagree with you, but you understand my position at least. And that's the
Hmm.
classical liberal view, is having those kinds of discussions. And that's just completely gone now. Now
Hmm.
it's partisan, and it calls any view that disagrees with it bigoted, white nationalist, white supremacist, anything like that. So they don't understand the other position. Say just a conservative Christian, run-of-the-mill conservative Christian, not even super conservative, just conservative. They don't understand what that view is. They just think that must be white nationalism. So the classical liberal days are gone, and I think parents need to know that, because most parents are probably still working out of the idea that, okay, the university tries to be neutral, and it's just not true anymore.
Mm-hmm. There was a book that I recommend often, Jonathan Haidt, Professor Jonathan Haidt, his book, The Righteous Mind.
Yep.
That book was written, I think it was like 2008, 2010. And the one thing that I remember from that book, it was during some pretty partisan days, at least relative to where we'd come from, nothing compared to now. But there was a study that he cites in that book that demonstrated that conservatives could clearly articulate the liberal viewpoint. They could explain why liberals believe what they did.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
They would disagree, but they could understand. But when they surveyed liberals can only, their only thought was that anyone who believes something conservative must be because they're evil somehow.
Yep.
Like they were completely unable to articulate the conservative, scientifically proven, studied in this study. And I think that's really indicative of where we're at today. It's like, no, I understand what liberals believe, having been one myself. Right. And I think that there are honest actors and dishonest actors. And I think that's true. But when you put forth conservative or Christian viewpoint, it can only be because you're evil.
Yep.
It can only be because of that. It's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. And that's where these really loaded terms come out, like bigot. One of the things that I got involved in last year was that Dennis Prager was coming to campus to speak.
Yes.
And he was going to give a talk. He has this thing he's been doing for 20 years about happiness, how to be happy. And he's well known for that. And he was going to come give a talk about that with a couple other people. And the vast majority of our honors college wrote a letter denouncing him as a white bigot, or as a bigot and a white nationalist. And so I started defending him, and that landed me on his show.
That's Prager.
I know. I ended up on his show. And I told him, hey, they're calling you a white nationalist. And he just laughed and said, yeah, that's the first time in my life anyone's called me that, right? They might call me the opposite. They might call me a Zionist, not a white nationalist. Yeah. So it just shows that these professors know nothing. And what they did was they got quotes from Dennis Prager to put in their letter. Everything they wrote about him was from Media Matters. So Media Matters would take one snippet and no context. And you could do that to anyone. You could get me saying, atheists say there is no God. And you could take Anderson says there is no God, and just take that quote out and not the first part. And they did that kind of thing to Dennis Prager. And so they didn't even cite his show. They cited Media Matters. And so it's just poor scholarship. Any of us professors would tell our students, hey, you can't use that as a source. You've got to go to the original source, but not when it comes to their own disagreements. And that's what I see time and time again is professors do as I say, not as I do, because they belittle their opponents, they insult their opponents, they dismiss their opponents, they don't even try to understand their opponents. And their opponents are about 53% of the population, right? So what was it? 70 million voters voted for Donald Trump. Well, we're having a speaker at ASU this week. She's being paid money, given an award to come speak at ASU about race relations, Jamel Hill. She said every Trump voter is a racist. So those 70 million people and all their families, so over half the population, is a racist. That's what ASU thinks will heal race relations. There's no talk being given by anyone on the other side. Like bring a Dennis Prager in or someone like that. Nothing. Just this is presented as the talk on race relations. So that's what I mean, where it's not even pretending to be neutral anymore.
Mm-hmm. Have you had conversations with professors that you work with where you've watched their own personal views over time kind of evolve? Like maybe they were more aligned with you at one point in time, and as this has come in, you've watched them kind of shift and now be opposed to you?
Yeah, I absolutely. So we went from, like I said, classical liberalism, which we can critique philosophically. Yeah. Like at the end of the day, I don't think that there is anything neutral. I do think there's common ground among all humans, but not neutrality. But in this system, in this context, we'll call it classical liberalism. It's what I explained a few minutes ago. But I've seen it shift from that and what we might call also multiculturalism, which is a view which easily turns into relativism, but it doesn't have to be. And that just simply says people from lots of cultures can get together and we should try to understand each other. So it
Hmm.
shifted from that in the 90s. The 2000s seemed like a kind of gray shifting area. But once we get to 2010 is when I noticed that it's gone from that to this view we now call DEI, more of a militant liberalism that says all the other views are wrong and they're so wrong, they shouldn't even be given a place at the table because you don't give bigots a place at the table. So by calling
Hmm.
Christianity or Judaism bigoted, you're saying those guys shouldn't even be here to discuss stuff. They're so bad they're
Hmm.
bigots. Not just that they're mistaken. So it's shifted into that. Now I don't know the causes. There's really smart people like Jonathan Haidt who study that kind of thing. It does seem to overlap with when President Obama was elected. I don't know that there's a causal
Hmm.
relationship to that, like that caused anything, or it could be the other way around because people were becoming more like this that they voted that way. But it seems like it started there and it's only got worse when President Trump got elected. That seems like when it just came to the surface and people threw off all bounds of classical liberalism and just said, I'm going to call Republicans the worst names I can think of.
Hmm. And that you've probably lost friendships and colleagues and or like me, like family members. Like there's a real cost for having a backbone these times.
Well, that's a good word you bring up, backbone, because as I was thinking about your show, I said, what would a virtue be that I would want to discuss with men?
Mm.
And the one that came to mind is courage. And I don't think that courage is well understood in our day. I see there are philosophers who deal with Christian philosophers now who write books on humility, for example. But
Hmm.
their view of humility tends to be what I mentioned earlier about being able to manipulate Christians. Being humble means you
Yeah.
don't take a position, you don't want to offend the other person. It's going beyond classical liberalism I was mentioning before, because in classical liberalism, you can say, here's my view. I think it's true, and I think I can argue against your view. But this
Hmm.
view is more about the feelings and not offending other people. And so it actually ties in well, that view of humility ties in well with the radical DEI stuff. In
Hmm.
contrast to that, I was thinking about how it's because courage is not really well understood. And courage tends to mean, in people that hold this view of humility, they'll think of courage as being abrupt, uncaring, stampeding over your opponent, maybe toxic masculinity. And so
Hmm.
actual courage doesn't get talked about. And therefore, we aren't really able to teach our children how to have courage. But in our day, I think it might be the central virtue we need to exhibit as Christians.
Hmm. Oh, I fully agree. And this would be interesting because you're also a pastor, and so one of the things that I've noticed relative to what you were just discussing is that there's a way in which Christianity has kind of been inverted and turned in on itself. That humility to the point of self-destruction, right, has
Oh,
become
yeah. Yep.
has become a virtue, right?
Yeah.
And it's this odd thing that I have to find ways to kind of fight in terms of dialogue. Maybe we can kick that around for a second because I think it's really important for men and women to get.
No, you're 100% right. Loving your neighbor turns into being willing to commit suicide. So
Yeah.
you're willing to destroy everything about Christianity to prove you're sorry about the past and that you're taking care of the marginalized now or something like that. So yeah,
Hmm.
it's almost like any standing up for yourself, courage on this view I'm critiquing says, well, that's selfishness. You should be willing to give that
Hmm.
up. And so defending Christianity is immediately white nationalism. Oh, you're just a white
Hmm.
nationalist then because you're defending Christianity. And so it's a
Yeah.
real trick. I don't think it's a trick in the sense that the people doing it are doing it disingenuous. They really believe this stuff. But
Yeah.
it's a trick in the sense that they're manipulating Christians to say, oh, yeah, I don't want to be selfish or stand up for myself. So I guess I should go along with what the radicals are saying. That's what Christianity teaches. And if you ask people, what did Jesus come to do? Well, he was a pacifist who came to pay for the poor, to have food. And
Yeah.
he got killed because he opposed the powerful people of his day. And that's what they don't think of him as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He's just a good
Right.
example of a 21st century liberal.
That's right. Yeah. There's the nice hippie, long hair, bearded, lamb carrying Jesus. They don't really encounter him for who he is, right? As someone who upset the religious, the political, and the economic authorities of the day, but
Yeah.
not to bring about some liberal order. Please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah, if anything, the parallel today between the Pharisees is the radical liberal who says you have to virtue signal. to be in the right group, you've got to do these virtues and let the rest of us know you're doing them or you're not in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Professor Joe Rigney from he's up in Moscow, Idaho. He did a whole thing about that recently, like a talk, maybe it was about a year ago, about how the LGBTQ plus community are the actual Pharisees, sexual Pharisaism, that they invent all these rules that then you have to go along with in order to be virtuous.
Yep.
It's not the people who are proposing traditional sexual morality that are the Pharisees. It's the LGBTQ people who are.
Yeah, and that's where the manipulation comes in, because the conversation will start off by saying, well, in the past, Christians abused people from this group. And so isn't that terrible? And you might say, well, yeah, I mean, that shouldn't have happened. You shouldn't abuse people or overstep your authority. That's terrible. And say, so we really need to make up for that then, right? And kind of turn the tables for a little bit and say, well,
right.
Yeah, I guess you're right. That only makes sense. That's fair. And so you've got them right away. So people's failure to know history leads them into being manipulated as well. And one or two cases are brought up where someone was mistreated, and there's been people mistreated, no doubt about it, on all sides, right? You don't have any monopoly of people being mistreated in one group or another. But so they'll bring up a case or two and say, look, what doesn't this really tug at your heartstrings? And because of that, you're currently guilty, even though what happened in the past was we learned a lesson in how to put protections in place, so we don't do that now. But you're still currently guilty for something that happened in the past. And because of that, you got to do mea culpas, and you got to give up your power, and you got to stop defending yourself. So it's very manipulative. And I think Christians need to know how to correctly repent, but have with that courage. And repentance doesn't mean just self-destruction.
What you just talked about is one of the huge reasons that contributed to my conversion, becoming a Christian in 2020, because I saw the manipulation of the George Floyd riots and Black Lives Matter, and I could feel the way that it was trying to get its hooks in me to get me to apologize for something that I had nothing to do with.
Wow,
like I had nothing to do with slavery, right? Like just because someone had the same skin color as me 300 years ago, right? Like if I could go back in time, I would stop them. So I don't have to bear this person's guilt because I can't repent for their sins. And I could feel the hooks trying to get in me and bring me down to my knees for an ideology that I didn't share.
Yep.
And I found that Christianity was the only religion that I had discovered, because I had been a worldwide quest to understand the world religions, that actually had a doctrine of repentance for sin, where I could say, I have repented for the things that I have done wrong, and I cannot repent for the sins that other people did wrong. And so it gave me the strength to stand. But so many Christians don't seem to understand that, and they're so quick to fall to their knees for these. They're really doctrines of demons. There is a magic, to it, like a truly wicked spellcraft. Kind of to it. So maybe we can talk about how Christians can resist some of this, the shaming and the guilting for things that they had nothing to do with.
Yeah, well, and on top of it, not only did you not have to do with slavery, and you said if you could go back in time, you'd oppose slavery, but the vast, vast, vast majority of Americans that opposed slavery were all white Christians.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so they suffered greatly in the Civil War to end slavery. So the idea that, well, no one did anything, what? I mean, that's why I say you need to study history and find out what payments were already made, what suffering was already gone through in order to end slavery. And the anti-slave movement, the Emancipation movement, was a Christian movement.
Mm-hmm. That's right. William Wilberforce, I believe, right?
Yeah. So all of the blame that comes up, the ideologically, I'm going to use a word, and my colleagues will go, when I say this, but ideologically, it just traces to Karl Marx. And my colleagues will say, come on, we're not all Marxists. But if you look at who their thought leaders are, like Paulo Freire, all of those guys, I self-identify as Marxist. They don't hide it. Well, the American professor might be a little bit squeamish, but not always. There's some of them that will say, I just am a Marxist. But some of them have replied to me and said, come on, this is not the McCarthyite era. We're not hunting communism. But it's like, yeah, but everyone you follow is a communist. And their critique of the West, communism has always hated Christianity. They're just continuing that propaganda because Christianity and the Christian family were the things that prevented Marxism from taking over the West. And so they've tried to undermine that for the last 100 years. And so I think ideologically, Christians need to wake up and know that the Marxists always use, don't you care about the poor, don't you care about the downtrodden, to get people to come over to their side. You've got to know the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. Have you had any success, like when your colleagues say we're not Marxists, and you point out that they follow Paulo Freire or Herbert Marcuse or
Yep,
Gramsci or whoever,
exactly.
right? Have you had any success convincing them, like, no, you might not be a Marxist, but you follow all these people and you profess their
Yeah.
teachings, and they were all Marxists, so
Well, then they get into,
does
well,
it
there's
click?
different kinds of Marxists, and because I mean that's what's intellectually dishonest, because you and I've been calling myself a Christian. I don't specify, hey, just so you know, I'm reformed, and I also don't deny them.
Right.
I don't. When you say you're a Christian, I'll say no, I'm not, because in my mind I think I'm reformed. But that's what it's like. It's
Right.
like, you're a Marxist. No, I'm not. I'm brand 10 of Marxists. Okay, but it's still under the umbrella of Marxism.
That's
And
right.
so they'll try to be a little bit, but what they want is a strong. They're materialists, and I should qualify that, because some of them will say I'm not. I'm spiritual, and I had a really good discussion with a friend of mine he's Taiwanese, so he's studied Chinese communism his whole career. He's a theologian, and he said there's actually a spiritual component to Marxism, where they view matter as having almost a spiritual nature that always goes towards improvement. So it's not just
Okay.
like
Mm-hmm.
dead matter. Maybe in Newtonian physics, it may or may not improve itself. But in Marxist materialism, it's always striving for better. So there is a spiritual element there, not just
Mm-hmm.
purely like Epicurean materialism. So say, fine, that's true, but that's what you believe in. You deny God the creator. You deny the need for scripture. You believe that a strong centralized government can better take care of people than themselves. And that's Marxism. I mean, that's just what it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's Hegel, right? That's
Yeah,
Hegel. The world spirit is always moving
exactly. No,
towards
that's right.
improvement, and that's yeah, and that's where Marxism got its sort of theological power of saying that, like, why should the state that I'm advocating for, communism, be better than the state that we've come from? It's because we're always moving towards improvement.
Yep.
It's not just a change from one to another. It's actually it's an improvement on the current condition, and that came from Hegel.
Yeah, no, exactly, 100%. That's what, and the state as the source of good and evil, and the source of your care, as really the expression of God. So, yep, that's all
Mm-hmm.
Hegelian dialectic, and Marx calls his the materialist dialectic, but that's where it comes out of, is Hegel. So
So
that's one thing. Is so
but
so talking to, you asked me the question. That was kind of a long-winded answer to
yeah,
the question of um, what do we tell parents? Well, first is just know that we're no longer
yes,
in the old days where it's neutral and your kid can get a neutral education. That's gone. And then second, know that you're being taught a whole system, and it's on you to know what that system is. They're going to try to manipulate you with some of your Christian virtues, and you've got to
mm-hmm.
prevent yourself from getting manipulated by knowing what they're actually teaching and say, no, I don't think so. My view of Marx is that he's the most successful cult leader in history. I think he's teaching a Christian cult. He uses a lot of Christian virtues, a lot of Christian ideas. He specifically observed Methodist revivals in England and wanted to imitate them. So a lot of the care for the poor and the coal workers in Wales, let's say, came out of the Methodists, and they did great Christian work.
Wow.
But Marx saw that, and he wanted to secularize it. So it's a secular cult, so to speak, and it's been the most successful in history so far, right? The 20th century is dominated by
Yeah.
millions and millions of people who said, this is the way to the good life. This is the way to utopia. And they mass murdered millions and millions of people if they
Yeah.
disagree with them. So I think Christian parents need to know it was successful for a reason. You got to make sure you're not manipulated by it.
And I want to talk about that, and just to really bring it into focus. I had seen that there's a discussion that happened recently about the politics of perverts. Do you want to talk about that real quick? Because this will make it real clear, and then we can talk about how to notify parents, etc.
Yeah, well, that was one of my Substack posts, and I'm using that word because that's the ASU name for it. So I'm not using the word as an insult. I'm quoting ASU had an event called Politics for Perverts, and I think it's based on a book of that title, Politics for Perverts, coming out of
Mm-hmm.
the University of Chicago, which is not, that's a big press. That's a
Oh my goodness.
qualified press. And so the idea of the book is that, well, they call sexual minorities, but they name them, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's uh, bisexual, but then it's also like what they call nudist, and furry was on the list. So there's a whole
Oh,
list of things, and they say these are people who are they're taking back the name pervert to make it theirs, and say that they're going to be involved in promoting these lifestyles now. And so that's being normalized at ASU. There's no counterpoint. It's not as if you have this politics for perverts, then you have another event, politics for the wholesome, politics for the biblical family. There's not two views. There's just this view that's given. And so that's an example where you got to ask yourself, do I want to spend $15,000 a year to have my kid go to talks called Politics for Perverts? So that's why I said courage comes into it.
Well, so let's talk about how this courage touches down, because obviously any Bible-believing Christian parent would look at a talk being given at a university called Politics for Perverts, based on a book that they're then thereby promoting. So it's a worldview, it's a book, right? It's a legitimization, and it fits into the entire transgender, pornification of the culture as well. And so you're going to be sending your child into a university, which frankly, ASU has a reputation as as being a school that likes a good time, right? That's definitely true. And so, but like you're launching, not that there aren't great professors, present company included, who are committed to teaching, but it's a big school, right? So you're throwing kids into the middle of this mix, and now you've injected the politics of perverts as well. And so, like, how do we reach out to Christian parents and let them know you're going to be paying for your kids to be exposed to this?
Yeah. Well, I think that that's one reason I started my Substack. I always end my Substack addressing parents, students, donors, legislators, and pastors. And I say, those 5 groups, I'm bringing this to your attention. You've got to do something about it, and do something respectfully. There's small things you can do, like emailing ABOR. I have a post on how to do that. And you can just respectfully tell ABOR, which is the Arizona Board of Regents that oversees all of our universities, hey, this is not right. But you can also vote with your feet and say, you know what? Grand Canyon University, Arizona Christian University are right down the road. I'm not going to go send my kids into this, because that is something that administrators care about. They care about attendance. And until parents start saying, I'm not sending my kids to this, the administrators will say, who cares if you're upset? Who cares if Anderson has a Substack? We're still growing in our number of students.
Oh, got it. So parents shouldn't just not apply to send their kids there. They should write into the Board of Regents and say, I have chosen not to apply to send my kid there because of this. So they know, because they'll never know someone who doesn't apply unless you tell them that you haven't and why. Yeah,
let them know that we're not going to do this anymore. Now, here's the thing about academic freedom. You need academic freedom. I'm pro-academic freedom. But we can be empirical about it. Have we been using our academic freedom for good things? You want freedom to be good, the freedom to be good. You can empirically study, has academic freedom increased godliness or increased wickedness? That would be an empirical study you could do. I think you and I both might have intuitions about how it's going to come out. But the academic freedom I've seen has not increased professors worshiping the Lord, praising his name, committing their lives to Christ. They're not using their academic freedom for that, but they're using their academic freedom to do things like politics for perverts. So the question is, what happens when freedom's misused? What do you do? Well, I think that's where you need courage. You need people to stand up and say, this is wrong.
One of the things, you mentioned Grand Canyon University. I saw also on your Substack that you had said you were perhaps in a meeting with your colleagues, and you mentioned Grand Canyon University, and someone said they're not scholars, they're evangelicals.
Yeah, well, I didn't mention them, but someone did say that. I was just observing, and someone was, another professor was talking about an encounter he had with some GCU students, and they told him about their major, and he happens to teach that major, and so he started asking them some questions, and they didn't know much. So he's using it to say, yeah, GCU students aren't getting a good education, and then he said a dismissive comment, but I know they're not really scholars there, they're evangelicals. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute, because I'm within the broad umbrella of evangelical, and so I would say that, man, I can't imagine anyone else, any other religion being commented on like that.
That's right.
And that's one of the things where I said, that's just not right. You can't say that kind of thing, and no one cares. And that's what's fascinating to me is if anyone else had said that, everyone in the room would have said, whoa, you knock that off. That's bad. Not one professor spoke up.
Did anyone happen to recognize that that they're kind of referring to you, this 20-year professor of philosophy? Like, excuse me.
Yeah, I know. Well, that could
talk about me.
It could have been a bar, but me. I think he probably didn't have me in mind. It was just a really condescending view of Christians. They're not intellectual. It's funny because like a week later, I was at a conference with Noll. And he wrote the book, The Evangelical Mind, about evangelical scholarship. So it's just funny to be like, there's actually a whole bunch of literature that's been done over the last 45 years with guys like George Marsden and Mark Noll about this exact question.
Can you speak about that for a second? Because I've observed that there is a tendency, or I believe there was a tendency, or there is one, sort of an anti-intellectual strain within evangelicalism. Right? That was my impression before I became a Christian, that Bible-believing Christians were rubes. And of course, I can't figure out why that's true, but that seems to be something that has legs to it. But it sounds to me that this is a question that's been confronted.
Yeah, so I'll kind of zoom out 200 years. And of course, the universities 300 years, the universities in America that we think of, all the notable universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, were all Christian universities and founded for that reason. Some of my scholarship is about Princeton, specifically Presbyterian history, and the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians were very influential in education. They wanted educated ministers. They wanted education in lots of fields. A lot of the Americans that were in science were Presbyterians or Episcopalians pushing those fields forward. So that's the 1800s. 1900s, we have this debate about fundamentalism. And I think that's where you're getting your impression, which is that the fundamentals, which actually came out of Princeton-educated professors, and what they were saying was there's fundamental things that we're not going to give up about the faith. But then it got taken over by people who now you think of as anti-science, because that was the manipulation used to say, well, these are just anti-science people, and we love science. And so it is true that I think that among the fundamentalists, many of them became anti-intellectual because they distrusted the trained professor who's given up the Bible, he's given up God. We don't trust him. And so in that sense, they were anti-intellectual. But then about the 1960s, there was a kind of renaissance of evangelical scholarship starting in places like Wheaton outside Chicago. And so schools like that began putting out scholars. There was Francis Schaeffer, George Marsden and Mark Noll came out of that. Alvin Plantinga has been really popular. He came out of Calvin. So there's been scholars the last 40, 50 years that are evangelicals, and they're trying to reinvigorate the intellectual life. William Lane Craig is another notable one. So it's just not true anymore. If someone's thinking that way, they're thinking back to like the first half of the 20th century, and they're just out of date. If you look up like big debates, even scientific debates on YouTube, you'll see guys who are scholars. I mean, William Lane Craig, he's not a scientist, but he's really sharp. Atheists are afraid to debate him. He's good on science even.
Yeah, he played a big role in my conversion as well, because I remember him talking about evidence for the Christian faith, and I think I remember him talking about how women found the empty tomb, and relative to the culture at the time, that was not the predicted behavior. Yeah, it's like, why would, if they were making this up, they probably wouldn't have done that, right? Yeah, given the status of women. Yeah. So
he's an example where that's just not true anymore. But I think what the idea is that a school with a dogma or faith statement or creed can't have really free academic inquiry. And that goes back to my question a moment ago. Have you been using your academic inquiry well? Has it made you a better person or a worse person? And on top of that, the idea that you can't, the idea of a faith statement, I believe, is this. There are some things we know. They've been figured out cumulatively, so a faith statement today would be bigger than the first century. But there's things that we know, and whatever's in the faith statement, you can and should prove it. If you don't know how to do that yet, you need to get up to speed and figure out how to prove it. So think about the Nicene Creed or something like that. And that's how knowledge grows. But the current radical left view is that you can have no such faith statements. We don't know anything. It's rooted really in academic skepticism. The only things we know happen to be Marxist things, but outside of that, we don't know anything else. And I think that's just actually that's the anti-intellectual view. The idea that we can start off with God, the Trinity, Christ, the Bible, soteriology, and say we know these stuff. We don't need to reprove it. It's like the wheel. We've already made the wheel. We don't have to reinvent it. You can learn how to make a wheel, and you should learn how to prove these things, but we've already done that. We got to keep moving on. And that's actually, I think, good for intellectual curiosity, because you're not repeating the same things. You're building on past insights. And I use an example, like, isn't that what you'd want out of a medical doctor? Do you really want a medical doctor like having to reinvent the very first parts of medicine? No, you want him learning at Mayo Clinic all the latest stuff. So we expect that out of our scholars, and we should expect that in philosophy and religion also.
Yeah, you're talking a little bit about postmodernism, this idea that science even is no longer an authority, that now it's like it's all my subjective truth. And I've actually been seeing that even that idea is cracking now, and we have this kind of neo-paganism revival happening as well. Now that is the one thing we can say for sure is this neo-pagan revival, and then this sort of hard materialism as well, the Marxism as you mentioned.
Well, they kind of go together too, and it's the I think it's Earth Day coming up or something. I keep seeing things about Earth, and it just turns into the Mother Earth goddess worship, eco mysticism. There's a spiritual element to the Earth, and we're harming the Earth. It comes out of movies like Avatar that try to teach this stuff to all the little kids, and they have no idea what's going on. They just like the graphics, and pretty they come out of it, and they're all eco mystics.
When you started at Arizona State 20 years ago, and you've seen all this come up, do you feel a little bit like a stranger in a strange land all of a sudden?
Oh, yeah.
In a place that was once very familiar?
Yeah, it's kind of like, hey, I came into this thinking that we're all going to be doing inquiry with certain rules. Like we mentioned before, we try to understand each other and give the best argument we can. I thought we had certain rules, and now all of that's gone. It went from like medieval, where you march out and you take some shots, we take some shots, we go home, and everyone follows these rules, to just guerrilla warfare, where all right, there's no more rules. You're calling me a bigot because I believe in Genesis chapter 1. You don't have any idea what conservatism is, but you call any Trump voters a racist. So yeah, it feels like the whole field has changed, and I keep hearing that. I mean, I don't think I'm unique. I might even not even be close to the first people. It seems like who's noticing that. People are noticing we're living in a really vitriolic time, and there's a worry. The reason why we develop something like classical liberalism is to avoid open conflict. We don't want open conflict with each other. We want to be able to come together, debate, live together, even though we have differences. I mean, obviously, you and I as Christians want people to become Christians, but we also don't want that to be forced on them. People can think through it themselves and make their own choices. And if they choose not to be in Christianity, we still need to all live together. So that's the classical liberal model, but it's been the radical leftists who are saying, no, we're getting rid of that. You've got to believe what we think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then it becomes, if we're going to have a war of worldviews, then we might as well play to win, right?
Yeah, well, that's
classical
what it is. Yep.
Liberalism went out the window. Yeah, we could have all lived together, but now we can't. So what do we do with this?
Yeah, and it is interesting. It's come up, especially with sexual identity. You mentioned that earlier, but that seems to be the main thing that's being used. Race somewhat, class and economic status somewhat, but especially sex. And I think if we had time to explore that, we'd see that's a pattern that happens many, many times in history. Is there's something about sexual expression that causes these kind of social disruptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a great book, Libido Dominandi, by Professor E. Michael Jones, that talks a lot about that. Mm-hmm. Yep. So I know we've just got a few minutes left. I wonder if you want to talk for a minute about your experience about showing up on the front page of Fox News.
Yeah, that was really interesting because I was coming home from an event, and a friend of mine texted me and said, hey, look at the Fox News app. And I opened it up, and there I was on the front page of it. I thought, wow, that's really funny. I didn't expect to see that. But that happened because of this Goldwater Institute case. They had filed this case against ASU, so I ended up on the news. I ended up on Fox News or Fox and Friends and some other shows because of that. Because, I mean, I think really the main thing I want people to know is that they have the ability to do something. Parents, you raise your kids up to 18 years old. Don't just think it ends, right? When you send them off to college, you still got to be thinking through what's the best place for my kid to become a better person. I'm going to be spending a lot of money. I want them to get a good education for a trade. I want them to learn some kind of job, sure. But I want a place that's going to make them a better person. You can look at what ASU is pumping out. Is that going to make them a better person? So I ask your audience to go to my Substack, Dr. Owen Anderson. You can see these articles. I have the link there for the Goldwater page, which has the actual case. You can read that. You can read through the transcripts of what ASU is teaching, and you can decide for yourself if you think this is appropriate use of your tax money.
Mm-hmm. And not to blunt the point, but there's also signs of hope. You wrote an article about the 10 Commandments being taught in Arizona schools. So Maybe you can speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, there is some pushback from legislators, and we only have a one-person majority right now. So it's super thin going into November. But we do have, let's see, that came out of a Supreme Court case, actually. We have some local laws that are really good, like the one I mentioned, that tax money can't be used to promote racism. So that's a great local state of Arizona law. And then we have another law working its way through right now that will require all syllabi to be public. And the syllabi have to include all the reading material. Now, to be honest with you, I thought they already were, because my department requires me to hand my syllabus in like a month before the class starts. But apparently some professors, specifically in the Honors College, and it seems to be a hub of leftist radicalism, the Honors College, I have a Substack article about an event they had on how to be a witch and the benefits of witchcraft. So that's the Honors College. I guess they were kind of hiding their syllabi until the semester began, because they're doing this kind of stuff and they want people to know. So anyway, that's going to be required. I think that's great. Obviously, professors are saying, oh, this is the end of the world. The state's getting involved when we do. Well, we're state employees first. So yeah, we have accountability to the state. And then secondly, your syllabus should already be public. I didn't know that was even private. You're a state teacher. What you teach should be public. So that's a local law. But then the one you're mentioning, I think, was actually the Supreme Court case that had to do with the high school football coach who prayed and got penalized, maybe even lost his job. That ended up in the Supreme Court, and they supported him. So implications of that include that you can mention the Ten Commandments without being fired. Now, I'm not going to say you can go in and start teaching the Ten Commandments were given by God to Moses and you should keep them today. But even in the past, even mentioning them would get you in trouble. Like, oh, you don't mention, that's religion. You don't mention that here. Whereas now it's like, no, that's, even if you think it's from a purely secular perspective, this is one of Exodus or Deuteronomy. Those are both part of the great books of the world. And the Ten Commandments are the great legal tradition of the world. You should be able to teach about that.
Excellent. Well, that's a hopeful signs, but obviously, there's still a ton left to do to reclaim a lot of lost ground, I guess.
Yeah, one thing I did, I'm actually studying Hebrew right now. I'm on my second semester, so I'm a newbie still, but I really enjoy it. And so one thing I put up on my door is the Shema in Hebrew and English, just to say, because everyone's door at work is like a noteboard for their political agenda, and some of it's sexual stuff. And so I was like, I'm going to have one thing. I'm going to have Deuteronomy chapter 6. That's the only thing I'm going to have on my door, because try to make me take it down.
That's right. That would be real. That'd be real discrimination. That's the word I'm searching for. Yeah. Well, God bless you, sir. Thank you so much for your courage and for your work in this institution. Again, you've mentioned your Substack, and I'll be sure to link that in the show notes. Is there anything else that listeners can do with and without college-age kids to support your cause?
Well, pray for me. I'd appreciate that, because I'm definitely experiencing opposition and pushback, and some of it's pretty vicious. So pray for me. I really appreciate that. And if you can share my Substack, the more people that see it, the better.
Wonderful. We'll be sure to do that. Thank you so much, Owen. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks
today.
for having me.